The roar of the engines was deafening, but nothing compared to the blinding panic that gripped him as the aircraft shuddered violently. The instrument panel flickered wildly, alarms blaring in chaotic unison. Come on, come on, hold together, he muttered, gripping the controls with white-knuckled hands. But it was useless. The blizzard outside raged mercilessly, thick snow and howling winds obscuring everything beyond the cracked windshield. The small plane spiraled downward, metal groaning under the immense pressure. Then, impact, a deafening crash. The world spun, pain exploded in his side. The violent jolt of the impact sent him into darkness. When consciousness returned, everything was eerily silent. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was dead. The cold was the first thing he registered, an all-consuming, bone-deep chill. He tried to move, but every muscle ached, his ribs screaming in protest. Snow had piled inside the wreckage, blown in through a gaping tear in the fuselage. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, visible in the freezing air. Then a noise, a faint whimper. His heartbeat quickened. He turned his head, wincing at the sharp pain that lanced through his skull, and then he saw it, a dog. A large, thick-furred husky lay just a few feet away, tangled in the debris. Its fur was matted with snow, its breath coming out in quick, panicked puffs. It whimpered again, struggling to move, but one of its legs was trapped beneath a broken panel. "Hey, buddy." "Easy," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to move, dragging his battered body toward the dog. His fingers were stiff from the cold as he worked to free its leg, carefully shifting the debris. The husky whimpered but didn't snap or growl. It simply looked at him with wide, trusting eyes. With a final heave, the metal gave way, and the dog was free. It yelped in relief, immediately scrambling to its feet and shaking off the snow. The man slumped against the wreckage, exhaustion creeping in. The situation was dire. The plane was unsalvageable. The radio was smashed beyond repair, and the storm outside showed no signs of easing. He wasn't alone, but he was still stranded. The dog sat beside him, pressing its warm body against his side, as if understanding their shared predicament. "Well, guess it's just you and me now," he muttered, running a shaky hand through its thick fur. Outside, the wind howled like a beast. Their fight for survival had just begun. The cold was merciless. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice, searing his lungs and making his chest tighten. His limbs were stiff, almost useless from the freezing temperature. He needed to move, now, or risk never moving again. The dog nudged his side, its warm breath visible in the frigid air. It wasn't just a companion. It was a reminder that he couldn't afford to give up. "All right, buddy," he exhaled, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We need shelter, and fast." He forced himself to his feet, his entire body protesting in pain. His ribs throbbed with each breath, but he couldn't let that stop him. The wreckage of the plane was useless. It was torn apart, exposed to the wind, and getting colder by the minute. His first instinct was to search for supplies. He staggered back to what remained of the cockpit, rummaging through the twisted metal. The emergency kit? There had to be one. There. A small, bright orange survival pack was wedged between two crushed seats. With numb fingers, he tore it open. Inside, he found a small thermal blanket, a half-full water bottle, a single energy bar, a flint fire starter, a hunting knife. It wasn't much, but it was something. The dog let out a soft whine, pawing at the snow-covered floor of the wreckage. It was impatient, or maybe it sensed something. Then he felt it too. The wind was shifting. He turned his head and saw it. The storm was getting worse. The swirling whiteout was thickening, cutting visibility down to just a few feet. If they didn't leave now, they might not get another chance. He slung the survival pack over his shoulder, gripping it tightly. "Come on, boy. We need to find cover." The dog didn't hesitate. As if understanding the urgency, it padded ahead, its strong legs moving effortlessly through the deep snow. Searching for shelter. The terrain was brutal. Each step felt like wading through wet cement, his boots sinking deep into the snow. Every movement drained what little energy he had left. His body screamed for rest, but he knew stopping meant freezing to death. The dog moved with confidence, sniffing the air, leading him forward. It was like it knew where to go. Minutes stretched into an eternity. His vision blurred, his strength faded, and for a terrifying moment, he swayed on his feet. His body was shutting down. Then, a bark. The dog had stopped just ahead, standing near a dark shape in the snow. A cave, a narrow opening between two jagged rock formations. Not perfect, but it was shelter. Relief surged through him as he stumbled forward, practically collapsing into the mouth of the cave. It wasn't deep, but it was enough to block the wind. The dog followed, shaking snow from its fur before circling a few times and settling down. They had shelter, but the cold was still a threat. His fingers trembled as he pulled out the flint fire starter. His breath was shallow, his limbs heavy. He gathered what little dry material he could find. Twigs, strips of fabric from his ruined jacket, even bits of seat padding from the plane. The first spark failed. So did the second. The third caught, but it was weak, flickering dangerously. Then the dog moved closer. It crouched near the fire, watching intently, as if willing the flames to grow. Finally, a small, fragile flame took hold. Heat, light, hope. He exhaled a shaky breath, holding his hands close to the warmth. The dog curled up beside him, pressing its body against his. He could feel its heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. "We made it," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the cave walls. The warmth was weak but life-saving. Every inch of his body ached, but for the first time since the crash, he felt something other than cold. The dog lay curled beside him, its thick fur pressed against his leg, radiating heat like a living furnace. Every few moments its ears twitched, always listening, always alert. He sighed, staring at the flames. His fingers still felt stiff, but at least they weren't numb anymore. His ribs, however, were a different story. Each breath came with a stabbing pain. Gritting his teeth, he carefully unzipped his jacket and checked his side. The fabric was damp. Blood. It wasn't a deep wound, but it had been bleeding longer than he realized. "Great," he muttered. The dog lifted its head, ears perked, watching him. Its ice-blue eyes studied him with an intensity that almost felt human. "Don't give me that look," he said, forcing a small smile. "I'll live." The dog tilted its head slightly, as if doubting his words. With a painful grunt, he dug into the survival pack and pulled out a strip of cloth. He'd have to make a crude bandage and hope for the best. Clenching his jaw, he pressed the fabric against the wound, hissing as pain flared through his side. The dog let out a soft whimper, then did something that stunned him. It moved closer and began licking the wound, its warm tongue carefully cleaning away the blood. His chest tightened, not from pain this time, but from something else. This animal wasn't just surviving beside him, it was helping him. For the first time, he reached out and ran his fingers through its thick fur. It was warm, rough with snow and ice, but solid, real. "Good boy," he murmured. "Guess we're really in this together, huh?" The dog let out a low, content rumble in response. Hunger and the search for food. By morning, the fire had dimmed and hunger had set in. The single energy bar in his survival pack wouldn't last long, and the dog needed food just as much as he did. He stood slowly, wincing as his ribs protested, and stretched his sore limbs. The storm had eased, leaving behind a thick, endless sea of white. The dog was already at the cave entrance, sniffing the air, alert. It turned back to him and barked once, sharp, urgent. "You smell something?" Another bark. The dog wanted him to follow. Gripping the knife from his survival kit, he cautiously stepped out into the snow. The cold bit at his skin, but his body had adjusted. It was still freezing, but at least it didn't feel like he would collapse instantly. The dog moved ahead, sniffing at the ground, then suddenly darted forward. "Hey, wait up," he called, stumbling after it. A few meters ahead, the dog had stopped near a small frozen stream. Its paws scraped at the ice, ears perked with excitement. Water. His heart pounded. He dropped to his knees and examined the surface. Thin ice. If he was careful, he could break through. Taking the handle of his knife, he struck the ice once, then again. Crack. A small break appeared, and soon a tiny pool of dark water formed. Desperately, he cupped some in his hands, bringing it to his lips. It was icy, almost painful to drink, but it was fresh. Clean. Relief surged through him. The dog, meanwhile, sniffed the edge of the ice, then suddenly lunged forward, snapping at something beneath the water. For a moment, he thought the dog had lost its mind. Then, a splash. His breath caught as he realized what had just happened. The dog had caught a fish. A small, wriggling fish dangled from its jaws, flopping weakly. The husky trotted over, tail wagging, and dropped it right at his feet. He stared at it, stunned. "You just..." He let out a disbelieving laugh. "Are you serious?" The dog wagged its tail harder, tongue lolling out in a pleased expression. Shaking his head in pure amazement, he picked up the fish and examined it. Not much, but it was food. They had water. They had food. For the first time, survival didn't seem impossible. Back at the cave, fire and trust. That night, the fire burned brighter. The fish, though small, had been a lifesaver, and the dog had eaten its share. He sat beside his new companion, watching the flames flicker. He hadn't spoken much since the crash. There had been no one to talk to. But now, as he stared at the dog, he realized he wasn't really alone anymore. "You know, I never even asked your name," he mused, reaching out to scratch behind its ears. "Not that you'd tell me." The dog let out a soft woof, nudging his hand in response. He chuckled, thinking for a moment. Then, an idea struck him. "How about Ghost?" The husky tilted its head, considering. Then, as if in approval, it let out a sharp bark and wagged its tail. "Ghost it is," he said with a small smile. As the fire crackled and the cold winds howled outside, one thing became clear. They weren't just surviving, they were fighting together. The wind outside was picking up again. The cave had been their shelter for days, but something deep inside told him they couldn't stay here forever. He sat near the fire, rubbing his sore muscles. His ribs still ached, but the bleeding had stopped. His body was adjusting to the brutal conditions, but survival was getting harder. The food was running out. Ghost, his loyal companion, lay beside him, ears twitching at every gust of wind. The husky was alert, always listening, always ready. "We need to move," he murmured. Ghost lifted his head at the sound of his voice, those icy blue eyes locked onto his. "You know it too, don't you?" he sighed, running a hand through his tangled hair. "We can't wait for help. We have to find it." The fire crackled, filling the silence. No one was coming. If they wanted to make it out of this, they had to act now. The journey begins. They set off at dawn. The cold was brutal, but the sky was clear for the first time in days. It gave him hope, a cruel, fragile thing in a place like this. Ghost led the way, his paws crunching in the deep snow. The husky's stamina was impressive, his body built for this terrain. Meanwhile, every step felt like a battle for the man. His legs were weak, his breath heavy. Every incline stole what little strength he had left, but stopping wasn't an option. The sun had barely climbed over the peaks when Ghost suddenly froze in place. His ears shot up, his body stiffened. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Instantly, the man's pulse spiked. He reached for his knife, his eyes scanning the snow-covered slopes around them. Then, movement. A shadow flickered between the trees up ahead. Then another. Wolves. His stomach twisted. He counted 3, their dark forms moving silently through the snow, watching from a distance. Predators. Ghost stood his ground, his fur bristling, teeth bared. The man clenched the knife tighter, knowing full well he didn't stand a chance in a fight like this. Wolves didn't waste energy unless they were sure of a kill. They were testing him, measuring the risk. Heart pounding, he slowly reached into his survival pack. He had one thing that might save them. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the flare gun. With a deep breath, he raised it and fired into the sky. Bang! A bright red flare shot upwards, hissing as it burned against the pale sky. The wolves flinched, startled by the sudden explosion of light and noise. For a moment, they hesitated. Then, one by one, they melted back into the trees. The tension in his body eased, his knees nearly buckled. Ghost remained standing, his eyes locked onto the tree line until he was sure the danger had passed. Then finally, he turned to his human and nudged his leg as if to say, "Let's keep moving." A new discovery hours passed. The exhaustion was unbearable, but he kept moving. He had to. Then, just as his strength was about to fail, he saw it. A thin, winding trail in the snow. It wasn't an animal path. The edges were too defined, the snow too compact. Someone had walked this path before him. His chest tightened with hope. A way out. A chance. He turned to Ghost, who was already sniffing the air, tail wagging. The dog smelled something human. "Let's go," he whispered, pushing forward. His legs were screaming. His body begged him to stop, but he didn't, because for the first time since the crash, he knew they weren't alone. They were getting closer, and rescue might be just ahead. The wind howled as he trudged forward, every muscle in his body screaming for rest. His breath came in ragged gasps, his ribs aching with each step. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. Ghost moved ahead of him, paws barely sinking into the snow. The husky was alert, sniffing the air, his tail wagging with newfound energy. He sensed something. Then, through the blinding white haze, the man saw it. A structure. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, another cruel mirage. But as he staggered forward, the shape became clearer. A cabin. His breath caught. It was small, almost buried beneath the heavy snowfall, but it was real. Smoke curled faintly from a chimney. Someone was there. Adrenaline surged through him. "Come on, Ghost," he rasped, forcing his legs to move faster. The husky bolted ahead, barking furiously, his voice echoing through the mountains. The man followed, stumbling, his vision blurring with exhaustion. Then, the door creaked open. A figure stepped out, bundled in thick layers of fur, a rifle slung over their shoulder. For a second, they just stood there, staring in shock. Then came the voice, hoarse, but unmistakably human. "Jesus Christ, are you okay?" Relief crashed over him, stronger than any pain, any hunger, any fear. He tried to speak, to call out, but his body had finally reached its limit. His knees buckled. But before he hit the ground, strong arms caught him. "You're all right, I got you," the stranger said, voice steady but urgent. "You're safe now." Safe. The word barely registered before darkness claimed him. Awakening warmth. That was the first thing he felt. Not the bite of the wind, not the numbness, but warmth. Slowly, he opened his eyes. Wooden walls, a fire crackling nearby. The scent of something cooking filled the air. He was inside, alive. A soft whine made him turn his head. Ghost. The husky sat beside the bed, watching him, tail wagging slightly. As soon as their eyes met, Ghost stood, trotted over, and pressed his nose against the man's hand. A weak chuckle escaped his lips as he ruffled the dog's thick fur. "We made it, buddy," a voice interrupted. "You're lucky your dog's smarter than you." He turned his head toward the stranger, the cabin's owner. An older man, weathered by the mountains, stood with arms crossed, studying him with sharp eyes. "That mutt wouldn't leave me alone till I came outside," the man continued. "If it wasn't for him, you'd still be out there. Or worse." He looked down at Ghost, realization sinking in. The husky had saved his life. He exhaled shakily, scratching Ghost behind the ears. "Guess I owe you one, huh?" Ghost just wagged his tail, as if he already knew. Moving forward, days passed. His strength returned. The cabin owner, Tom, fed him, tended to his wounds, and told him of a small outpost a few miles away. Once you're strong enough, I'll take you there. They've got radios. You'll get home. Home. The word felt surreal. The crash, the snow, the hunger, all of it had become his world. The thought of leaving it behind almost didn't feel real. But when he looked at Ghost, curled up by the fire, he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't leave alone. "You're coming with me," he said to the husky. "Not leaving you behind, not after all this." Ghost looked up, ears twitching, then, tail wagging, he nuzzled into his side. The man smiled. They had survived together, and they would go forward together, and rescue might be just ahead,